Welcome to Your Next Chapter, where we feature conversations with leading audio creators and industry experts shaping the future of podcasting. I'm Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts, and your host for insightful conversations that delve into the creative processes, challenges, and innovations driving the world of audio storytelling. Our guest for this episode, Neil Mody, is the CEO and co-founder of Headliner. Headliner is a leading tech company building tools for podcast creators. Their most popular product is a tool that adapts audio files into videos, which we use here at Next Chapter Podcasts. And however, they are constantly introducing new tools for audio creators around the globe. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be on. It's I met Nick a few months back, and I like the direction of where the show's going, and nice to be here. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, our executive producer Nick Kastner runs in these hoity-toity New York circles. So, of course, he bumped into you, and you had a compelling conversation. He said, we should talk. And I said, I know Headliner because when I started my company, we used Headliner daily. I mean, it was
great.
The beginning of Next Chapter 6 years and a couple months ago. I don't know what I would have done without Headliner, but when I found it, I was like, this is everything. So it really rapidly changed the company. And it was really kind of just me at the beginning. So I could do so much more with Headliner, and you've come so far. But I want to ask you, if you don't mind, if we dive into 2020. I know you've been around for longer than that. But in 2020, Forbes wrote an article titled "Headliner Turns Podcasts into Shareable Videos to Crack the Discoverability Problem." How has discoverability in audio improved since 2020? I'm curious.
Well, I think we're still on that journey, actually. So Headliner as a product came out in 2018. So you've been a user for a long time. So
from the get-go.
And so we were basically the staple of making those audiograms, I think, in 2018, 19, 20. And then I think that article, I don't remember it specifically, but we started introducing automation because it kind of our thinking is the more manual work that needs to go into this process, the less likely it's going to happen, number one, and it takes away from some other time. So I think, discovery is changing nonstop, mostly because if you think about what discovery is, it's finding something when you weren't looking for it. Okay. Sorry to get all geeky, but I'm a tech guy, but information retrieval has kind of two sides of the coin. There's search, where you want something and you'll type in some keywords. Obviously Google is kind of the number one solution for that on the internet. And then there's discovery. So I want this and give me this, or, oh, I didn't know I wanted that, but this looks interesting. Let me take that. And I think, frankly, I think audios have problems on both sides of the coin, actually. And not to be a Debbie Downer here, but I think podcasting's still very small, mostly because of those both sides of the coins not being very well handled. And I'm sure we'll get into it. But on the discovery side, I think we've been, probably, I'm going to blush in saying this, but I think we're probably the biggest discovery company in podcasting out there. I think our stats have it at like more than 100 million people see podcasts monthly because of us. And I think now, where that funnels to and how we retain those users and all that kind of stuff. But chances of listening to a podcast when you didn't want to listen to it, I think we do a very good job of that, but I think we still have a long way to go. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but that's kind of where it goes. And for us, it's always been meet people where they are. That's number one. You're going to only tell people about something and make them appreciate something if you are where they are. So social, which is where we started. Second was YouTube. which is kind of where it's kind of grown over the last few years. And since 2020, candidly, I think pre 2021, 2022, YouTube was almost a negative word in podcasting.
Mm.
People were anti YouTube. Actually, the majority of podcasters were anti YouTube in 2019, 2018, early 2020. COVID changed things. So first we focused on social, then YouTube, and now kind of our newest product is called Disco, which is the broader web. So while you're reading an article, we'll recommend a podcast as well, which you really have to see to experience, but we can talk about it as well. So I think discovery won't be solved until some company, and I think that's us, allows you to find a podcast or discover a podcast that you would appreciate at every moment of your journey on the internet, right?
Mm.
And if you think about how much we consume on the internet, I often jump into other mediums very quickly and rapidly, but podcasts are still mostly an island on the internet, is what I say.
Mm.
And until we draw more bridges to that island, we won't have succeeded totally on the discovery side.
I love that. And I also love the island analogy. I'm a person who's lived on two islands for the last 4.5 years
There
from
you go. I'm on an island as well, but one with a lot of bridges and tunnels.
Yeah, people don't think of New York as an island, but it absolutely is. And the most amount of business, maybe of any island, goes through there. But I'm curious, do you mind if we take a step back? Because I'd love to know a little bit more about your dedication to discovery. So prior to Headliner, um, which I can't say enough good things about your company and which you do to help podcasters who need the help, because discoverability, as you said, is a tremendous challenge. But I'm just wondering about your DNA. What were you doing before Headliner, and why also in this discovery field?
The quick answer is like this is very much like my DNA. Like so I went to grad school in computer science and philosophy. So like the mix of tech and reading or finding information at that time, it was mostly only reading before kind of pre-podcasting. I got a lot of gray hair, so that was circa 2000, 2001. So but I think I've always been interested in this kind of intersection of helping people get to more amazing information, which is either search or discovery. Back to the earlier point, and so our first company, like much of the team, has worked together for like a previous startup. So, 2009, we started one of the a content recommendation company, and so that helped you when you read an article will help you get to another article. And we were very big in the blogosphere. So my big thing is just helping people get to more amazing content. And we kind of, we had a successful kind of exit, and we got the band back together because, interestingly enough, this is 2015-ish. We got the band back together and we said, there's an interesting thing called, podcasting. I think Serial had already launched. I had been listening to podcasts on it. I wouldn't say as a devout listener, but like I remember listening to like This Week in Tech and some of the early ones, and I had a iPod and all this kind of stuff. But I think podcasting as a medium's ability to like inform and educate, and entertain, but for me more on the inform and educate side is really valuable. And so we kind of got the band back together and thought, hey, it's really hard to find information, hard to discover information. How can we kind of help here? And that's kind of, we took some different routes, but that's how we got to Headliner. And I think like we were chatting before, I think we're helping a lot of people on the internet discover podcasts that would have never discovered them before. And our job's not done, but it's very much in our DNA at this point as a team, and definitely me.
I love that you got the band back together. It's cool when you have people you trust and know you can count on, and can trust them to independently think and all that. It's that's a beautiful thing when you can find a new solution. I was actually I just to double click on this. I really was surprised when I don't know if you know Max Cutler at all with Parcast sold to Spotify and then he launches Pave Studios and I'm like, so you're just getting right back into the content game. Like you had this nice exit and then next thing you know you're like, I mean, I'm sure it's different. It's not Parcast, and things have changed tremendously since he launched and sold it, but.
Yeah, and it's probably a new version, right? And you kind of learn as you go. I think this and that company, which was called Enrelate and acquired in 2012, like we really caught lightning in a bottle, kind of. It grew like crazy, and similarly, I would say 2018 to 2000 through COVID to 22, I feel like podcasting was growing, and we were growing like bananas as well. Um, and then like I think we just still feel like podcasting still not as mature as it should be as a medium. And I'm sure we'll chat about this, but like I'm very opinionated here. Obviously, blood, sweat, and tears into this, but I think there's a lot more to do, and probably he feels the same way, right? Like you put so much time and energy into something, and you get it somewhere, and you progress, but you still feel like the job's not done. And I think that's kind of where we still are with Headliner.
When you talk about discovery and that being so important, something that I have the words of my mentor, Kevin Straley, the chief content officer at TuneIn, echoing in my mind. He used to say, and this is the first time I really launched podcasts for podcast sake. They weren't just some simulcast or kind of repurposed content from a radio show or TV show or something to that effect. But he used to say, whatever you do, you can make the best content in the world, but if you're doing it in this 10 by 10 box, it's going nowhere, and you got to find the right people. And a lot of times we talk to clients these days and they're like, well, what's the number I need to hit to have a successful podcast? And I've talked about this in the past, I think, on this show, but there's just no magic number. Yes, there might be a number that for advertisers is significant enough for you to be profitable. So yeah, that's a key number. But the reality is if you're getting to the right audience, the audience that you're trying to reach, whether you're trying to fundraise or whatever it is that your goals are, then that's the true measure of if you're successful, if you're reaching your goals based on hitting that right audience. So I'm curious, how you think about that and discoverability and specifically around podcasts that we all know that word of mouth is the most powerful way to convince someone to listen to a piece of content and maybe get hooked and follow or subscribe. But yeah, I'm just wondering how you think about that beyond the word of mouth. What are the different things you've tried?
Well, I have a little bit of a contrarian view. So
Okay.
here's kind of my take on it. I think, don't get me wrong, word of mouth is amazing, but for an industry to rely on word of mouth, it's going to be stuck unless it's high retaining. And I think we have to come to the conclusion that podcasts are not high retaining on the mass market. And let me talk you through my math. And I think Nick was super interested in this, so hopefully I won't bore you on it.
Please.
So about 8 billion people on the planet, something like that, roughly speaking, using round numbers. 5 billion people online. Okay. 5 billion people on the internet. Okay. Now, take a guess how many monthly listening to podcasts. Just a ballpark.
Oh, monthly.
Yeah.
If I know this correctly, I think via Apple it's 350,000.
350 million.
Oh,
Some
million.
some say 500 million. Okay, but 5 billion people online. Okay. So that's one. Let's be generous. Let's say it's 500 million out of
Okay.
the 5 billion, right? So in the past month, only 1 in 10 people on the internet have listened to a podcast. Only 1 in 10. Okay. So 9 out of 10 have not. Okay. So you have to ask yourself two questions. One is it that they've never listened to a podcast? And I feel like, yes, there's some of them that have never listened ever. Or two, they've listened, but they haven't listened again, right? Or they're not in the routine of at least listening once a month, right? And I think that's the category we're in, right? Meaning most people on the internet are starting to be very familiar with podcasts. They've heard of them before, but they're not dedicated listeners. And by dedicated, I don't even mean like every day or every week. I'm saying one a month, right?
Yeah.
So word of mouth has gotten us this far, which really isn't that far, like on a grand scale. Again, to give you some comparison numbers, I think YouTube's at like 2.5 billion monthly. It might even be closer to 3 billion at this point. Meta, WhatsApp alone is up in the multiple billions, right? Like podcasting, like so Apple and Spotify is kind of the leading platforms are only in the few hundred million. I know those sound like big numbers, but when you think about the planet and all of the people online, 5 billion people, a few hundred million people is nothing, right?
Wow.
And so the medium, again, I'm very opinionated here. I feel like the medium is being held back actually by Apple and Spotify.
Wow.
Okay. They actually are slowing down podcasting. Now they're doing amazing things for podcasting. Don't get me wrong. I don't on Apple's case, I don't think it's intentional. And in Spotify's case, I think they have their strategy and it makes sense for Spotify. But as a medium, podcasting's hope that Apple and Spotify or now YouTube or someone else is going to save it is probably its own kind of issue. If 9 in 10 people haven't listened to a podcast in the past month, you have to ask yourself why. Now, I really don't believe there's no good content. To me, it's because it hasn't gotten to them when they wanted it. And it's because the current way we consume podcasts, I believe, is kind of set up for only long-term retained listenership, which hasn't really worked to get to the next level. So, I'll give you an example. I'm very much like I deep dive into I have my kind of loyal podcasts that I listen to, and I'm obviously listening to more than one podcast a month, but there's many that I jump in and out of. Okay, and I know my way to do that, but the person who's not a podcast listener will never go do that, right? They're not going to go into a podcast app, number one. um, and number two, they're not going to come in and out as much as the way podcasts are set up, because we're also focused on people like following the podcast or listening to more of the shows, and set up this kind of notion of like, it's all or nothing. You're either a loyal listener to my show or I don't really care about you. And I think that's kind of, we've hit our ceiling, and it'll grow, but we're never going to get to these 9 out of 10 listeners if we don't embrace single episode listening and build ways for that to grow.
Are you talking about virality? Because I'm trying to key on this when.
I think two parts to it. One is virality. I think kind of has its own can of worms around how it needs to grow and whatever. But I think the average podcaster has been kind of brainwashed into thinking follow the show because there's all this like analytics around, like Apple used to download all these extra shows, which helps your download numbers, and all this kind of mechanisms around that at almost, and I get why, but at the same time, this is my point about Apple and Spotify having this like hold over the industry, that to the detriment of, hey, this individual show could be really useful in these scenarios, and I don't need anything more than that show like to succeed.
So you're talking about how bad the search sucks in each of these platforms, which is Very obvious.
Search is 100% part of it, but I would say even further than that. Like, I think the embeds suck. So I'll see YouTube embeds all over the internet, right?
Mm,
Like, and I think that experience sucks, and obviously I'm very biased because we're trying to improve that with disco and so
sure.
on. Um, and I think podcasting's ability to meet people when they might consume it
Mm,
has really sucked. But oddly enough, social, YouTube, and the broader web, I think that stuff is getting better. But I think again, you drop an episode, circa a few years ago. Back catalog listening is almost non-existent,
yeah,
right? And you would know this best, right? Like, you look at your back catalog listening, it's terrible. But if you look at back catalog blog posts, guess what? They get a lot of traffic from search, right? To your
totally.
point, they get random people still sending around those links, like, hey, this is useful to read.
Old Quora threads. Yeah, I it always comes up for me if it's relevant to what I want, then coming up.
There's ways that this information continues to live on in other mediums that podcasting hasn't really cracked. And I think again, I'm not trying to blame people. Like, I
Yeah,
think they're doing their game, and podcasting either has to do something better, and we're trying, and I think we've got a good shot at getting it to the next level beyond Apple, Spotify. But I think that's when podcasting can grow to get those 9 out of 10 listeners, when we're not expecting those 9 out of 10 to be a follower or a subscriber to the show. As long as we're locked into that paradigm, it's hard to get those listeners because they don't want to necessarily listen to every episode. They don't want to push notification of every episode. There's shows where you should focus on that, but to only want that out of listenership is, I think, a bad strategy.
that's really intriguing. Honestly, this is I can see why Nick wanted to have you on this show because these are some hot takes. But for real, I mean, I've had experiences. Not that I ever had a business arrangement with Apple, but I've had experiences with both Apple, Spotify, and iHeart. And discoverability and marketing was always the biggest challenge. With
Mm-hmm.
Spotify, we had a licensing deal for the 500 where when they featured an episode, we had Tommy Chong on for April 20th, and
Mm-hmm.
they promoted it, and it was probably our best episode by 5x in terms of
Mm-hmm.
performance.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true for getting New and Noteworthy on Apple, and algorithmically, like the benefit for certain shows that has occurred for some of the shows we produce has been tremendous. Of course, Oprah can walk straight into the door and get her New and Noteworthy without
Yeah,
much
yeah,
effort. We have to do a lot more to prove that this is something new and innovative.
yeah.
And then iHeart is just, they have so much content that cutting through the noise. You'd think it'd be bad at Spotify, but I think iHeart is the worst of them all. If we're going to start trashing networks, let's go for it.
I think what these other mediums have figured out, I think we still in podcasts, and I'm saying, the broader category, are still trying to get our kind of legs beneath us here. I think, again, I don't have the stat in front of me, but like YouTube, like I'm on YouTube every day, but I don't, subscribe to many channels or any at all, actually.
Yeah.
But guess what? How many YouTube videos I watch a day, right? Like, there's just, they come and they become aware either across the web, or once I'm on there, I'll poke around or something will get suggested to me, right? And so I feel like we have to really start thinking about a dual strategy, like not just followers as a medium, and then, like, hey, my content, this episode alone could be valuable. How do I make sure I get the most out of it in all the places that people should discover it? And I don't think we're really there yet. Some of the plumbing is not there. Some of the measurement tools aren't there, and the slicing of dicing of all this stuff. But I feel like, the next to your podcast title, like the next chapter of podcasting, and kind of the next wave is how does that happen? How do we get to those 9 out of 10 people that aren't listening? And I think a large part of that is really, how do you get all this surfaced to people in a different way than we've been doing? Because clearly that's not enough to make it mass market. Again, in New York, we kind of live in this bubble where everyone's listening to podcasts, and
Yeah,
generally you can go to a party at night and say, like, what podcast are you listening to? And it wouldn't be a weird question.
sure.
But you do that if you look at the like macro stats, like you can't do that at other places. Like, like that's just not, it's just not that mass market, right? So and I know, like, we like to tout these numbers and so on in the podcast industry, but like the numbers don't lie.
I love it. I love this explanation. We touched on globalization a little bit, and I
Mm.
do want to spend a little more time on that. But before we do that, can I ask you a little bit more about the disco product? I was
Yeah, yeah,
curious, what
yeah,
were the challenges in bringing it to market? And
yeah.
how do you feel disco helps kind of close that gap in the opportunity of those other 9 out of 10?
Yeah, well, so we actually luckily got one of our customers to put out some stats on what it does, and so I can kind of talk more freely about it. Luckily, but here's the deal, right? Like, so I'll use the company that allowed us to share stats with it, which is Newsweek just implemented it. So if you go to newsweek.com, again, they get something, I want to say, I don't know exactly, but on the order of 100 million people to their website on a monthly basis.
Mm,
Okay. So all of Apple and Spotify total to podcasts is somewhere in the 100 to few hundred million, right? So this, and Newsweek's a known brand and big, but
oh, yeah.
like, a company like CNN, Fox News, they're at 1 billion users to their website a month,
Mm,
right? And guess what? All of podcasting smaller than these websites, right?
mm,
So what disco is, and you kind of have to see it to experience it, but you read an article, and what we do is we try to intelligently link podcast episodes that could be interesting to you based upon what you're reading. So really kind of marrying our previous company and this company. So all of a sudden, what we've tried to do is, again, those 9 out of 10 listeners that have never listened to a podcast or don't regularly listen to a podcast, we get them to listen to a podcast, right? And so listenership to your podcast grows tremendously. Now, I'll be the first to admit they're not loyal listeners yet.
sure.
They were reading an article, and they are more interested in this headline of the episode, which, again, I want to point out, probably they never would have come across before. Now is surfaced to them, and they can discover it. And now they're able to basically listen to a clip of the podcast. And we do some cool things with tech where, like, if the article's about Donald Trump, we will jump into the podcast episode right when they're talking about Donald Trump, so
Mm,
that the reader, now listener, has this good journey around not listening to the theme music, nothing against the theme music of podcasts, not listening to the hosts like clear their voices and start, you know, um, talking back and forth around what the show is going to be about. Because again, as a non-loyal listener to a show, none of that stuff matters,
right.
right? And so we try to jump into the meat of the show, and then, hey, go figure, like, it actually works. Like, they're now interested. They will go listen to the full episode. They'll sometimes listen to more episodes, and some of them will even go follow, which everyone's so focused on, right? And so that, I think, is, again, like, this notion of helping people find the podcast, or I shouldn't be using the word find because they're not really searching, but
Yeah.
helping people discover the podcast when they weren't expecting it. And that's what disco really tries to do.
We talked a little bit about my experience working at XM Radio and Sirius
Uh-huh.
XM Radio. I remember an early, I want to say pre-merger stat, because we didn't do a lot of stats, or at least they didn't tell the employees much at the
Uh-huh.
time. But
Uh-huh.
I do remember that we were trying to get, for the business to be successful, you needed to have each listener have like 5 preset stations that they would listen to, that they would, constantly
Right.
have on their
Does
best.
like that magic number of retention or whatever, right?
Totally. And we found that it was such a large percentage of those who were paying whatever it was a month, $10 or, and I'm not sure what it is at now,
Yeah.
but they were listening to two. And that's not
Uh-huh.
enough to keep people to keep paying that amount. You have to
Mm.
get them hooked on these other stations.
Yep.
So that the takeaway I think is clearly transferable to what we're talking about in podcasting. And I'm not saying that you're within the iHeart app. I mean, the satellite radio example might still be the same, that you need to have a certain number of stations to keep that subscription
Right.
alive. Same is very much in line with like Netflix or Hulu or what have you.
Right.
But in podcasting, it's very much kind of an individual thing, not from the company corporate perspective, but from the each individual podcast. If you can hook someone on your best episode, like for one of my company shows, if we have a killer episode, yeah, maybe they go to our website and discover some other content.
Mhm.
But you're right. We're probably still a little bit more caught in the Stone Ages in terms of the getting that follow button and playing that algorithmic game.
Yep.
Whereas, what you're building, what you built with Disco seems to kind of change the game a bit. It's pretty exciting.
We hope so. I mean, again, the stats don't lie, and which is good, and which is we're so happy that they let us share that like so their listenership audience to their podcast went from 100,000 a month to over 1 million a month, right?
Wow.
And it's not, again, it's not anything more than just putting their podcasts in an intelligent way in front of people at the right time, right? And someone like this is now, again, trying to say, hey, you've got to sign in and follow my show. Guess what? No one's going to go do that,
Right.
right? Now, but if you focus in on, hey, if I'm a reader and I'm really interested in this article, like if I've got a podcast episode about the same thing or tangential to that thing, if they're that deep into it, podcasting does a terrible job about being there when someone's ready to consume it. And we focused in on, hey, we're going to be the medium to displace radio, like during this like commute time and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that has got us to where we are, and we don't have another stepwise function up without changing kind of strategies. And I think, like, I mean, sorry to keep on kind of talking this up, but like we do headliner, like the Disco unit does more audience than Apple and Spotify combined
Amazing.
for this publisher. And so for anyone getting a lot of traffic, again, the average podcaster doesn't, but all these media companies, I mean, I look at some of these shows, and even the New York Times Daily, like, okay, the New York Times Daily is doing, call it 20 30 million people listening to the show. I don't know off the top of my head, but in the tens of millions. If they intelligently place the daily across their website, that number would go up dramatically, maybe even 10x. Okay.
Mm.
And that's because they get so much audience to their website. The primary New York Times audience is still web, right? And so now that's not the case for every podcaster, but for the ones where their audience is, whatever it might be, they've got to solve that problem. And like, Instagram, like if you're a primary influencer, you need to figure out how to get your podcasts marketed to your Instagram channel. And, we've got tools for that. Other people have tools for that. I think that's just the message I want to kind of kind of push the industry towards. Go to where audiences are, and don't be such a silo medium, because that's kind of what it is. And that's only got us this far.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. I love this. Do you mind just one last question about Disco before I ask you the global stuff? I was curious about how long did that take to working with Newsweek to kind of customize things? Was there a lot of back end work on your team's end, or was this kind of a quick, quick down and dirty, got it done?
we actually have like a self-serve product that like for bloggers, like we're the blogosphere is kind of near and dear to our team's heart because of our previous company.
Sure.
So, so WordPress sites and those types of platforms. So, it, realistically, it takes some back and forth, and it could take a few weeks, but like in terms of the actual work, that's more about hoops, about deploying some code on the page and those kind of things. But the actual work, we're talking like hours. Like, it can, if someone said, if a large media company said, we had to get this, we need this, we want to try this, but we need to do it by tomorrow, like we've got all the tools in place, and we can crank it out. It's more about the, you know, getting code on the page and some of the logistics for like larger media companies or so on. That's why, like, again, a blog can get this up in a matter of hours via our self-serve product. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I was just curious about how many headliners users are outside of the US. What do you think about the global
Oh,
audience?
yeah. I mean, we've got a lot. I remember, I want to say, I want to say someone on our marketing team put together something we used in over 200 countries. I know that.
Wow.
Um, I think when I look at traffic, I think we're now, I want to say about 2/3 outside the US, and 1/3 US. And so we're very global. We actually we started staffing in Europe. We have got a few people in Europe now. Western Europe, obviously, given the BBC and
Oh yeah.
some of the larger brands. In the UK and also France and Germany and Spain too. Like we've gotten pretty good headliner usage throughout. But I would say in global, we've gotten growth in areas we wouldn't expect. Obviously, South America, Brazil, Indonesia. I think oddly enough, we get a lot of usage in the Philippines because there's a lot of like EAs and like podcast kind of
Yeah.
workflows go through the Philippines. So we see Philippines on our map a lot in terms of usage. And then obviously there's India, which is near and dear to my heart, given my ancestry,
Mhm.
like, 1.5 billion people that I think podcasting could get another leg of, of mass adoption across the globe, which is starting to uptick. And I was just on the phone with one of the biggest podcast hosts in India, Hubhopper, um, who's doing a lot of work about, again, trying to get to kind of integrate with some of the other media companies out there, because again, trying to get to all these people, when they're not as familiar with the Apple Podcast app. Number one, Apple itself is not as mainstream as it here is in the US, like, and
Yeah.
then so it's more Android driven. And then with Google podcasting sunsetting and now focused in on YouTube, and then discoverability of podcasts on YouTube. Anyways, that's a long way of saying you have to figure out these alternative ways to get distribution, and so they've done a good job of that. And so I think we'll see more growth outside, obviously, the U.S. than inside, but that's just a game of numbers to some extent, just population sizes and so on. China, obviously, I don't have much exposure to,
Yeah.
but the medium itself, I think, is here to stay. The question is, how does it get more mainstream?
I do have to wrap up here, but I'm really sad about that. So I'd love to have you back if you're open to it, to do another check-in. And I know we talked about before the interview possibly connecting at the podcast show in London, which I look forward to in May. But I do have one last question for you, and to be continued after this. But what's your next chapter? What's next for your career, whether it's with Headliner or outside of it? I'd love to know.
We're excited to see where kind of disco will take podcasting. Like, we're, again, like, if you just do the math on like some of those mega sites on the internet, they turning on disco can double podcasting. Like,
Hmm.
literally, it's that simple. Like, it's kind of crazy, but if you think about it, all of podcasting can quickly change if we can just figure out how to plug in to these massive audience acquisition streams. And I think, the one thing that hasn't happened on social is social was always separate because you never got that data back to your RSS feed, because it's, a video that isn't connected to your podcast. But if social, like what we've been doing for all this time, was already connected to your metrics I agree it's not the same as listening to the episode, but if that all was there, podcasting would have already been double the size it is today or triple the size it is today. I think we're so lost in like app metrics that we're forgetting about how to get to audience and what that means. And so I guess that's a long way of saying my next chapter is very much in Headliner and trying to grow to get to the next, 500 million podcast listeners, one step at a time. And then hopefully, my hope is, as a medium, there's no reason why podcasting should be smaller than video to this degree on the internet. And I think everyone in podcasting feels that way, but we just haven't figured out the means to make that happen. And, that would be my next chapter effort as a continuation.
It's been really great getting to know you a little bit, and I am excited for our next conversation, whether it's over a pint in London or elsewhere. I definitely look forward to that because you're clearly a leader with a big vision and a lot of experience in this department, and it's the biggest problem in content and podcasting specifically. So you're out here solving it. So I'm excited to get busy with this.
Thank you for having me on.
No, great to have you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Next Chapter. I'm your host, JT. Jeremiah Tittle. Our executive producer is Nick Kastner, and this is edited by Justin Cortese. We drop episodes bi-weekly. Please follow the show, because following the show is apparently not at all important. We learned. No, it is still important.
Still very much. Dual strategy.
Yes. Don't just stop there, though. Thanks so much for listening.